Hi, and welcome to this evening's Socialist Action webinar. We are very excited to be hosting this discussion with Rob Wallace. Rob Wallace is an evolutionary epidemiologist and public health geographer located in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is with the Agroecology and World Economics Research Corps. His latest book is called Dead Epidemiologists, and he's also the author of several other books, namely Big Farms Make Big Flu, Dispatches on Infectious Disease, Agribusiness, and the Nature of Science. Another book, Neoliberal Ebola, Modeling Disease Emergence from Finance to Forest and Farm, and Farming Human Pathogens, Ecological Resilience and Evolutionary Process. We're very excited to have Rob here today. My name is Mark Ostapiak. I am with Socialist Action. I'm on the national and political committees. I'm also a leading activist in an organization called SEIU Drop the Cops that is working to disaffiliate police from the entire labor movement. And since I'm a union worker in Socialist Service Employees International Union, I'm specifically working to try to disaffiliate police from my union. And I'm also the author of a recent article in Socialist Action newspaper called COVID and Capitalism. I think the title is basically mass vaccinations or a mandate for mass death. And I know that's quite a macabre sort of title, but given the fact that we have over 200 million COVID cases worldwide, over 4 million, approaching 4.5 million deaths worldwide, with the United States leading the world in cases and deaths. It's apropos that we have today an expert on pathogens and pandemics. So I want to let people know that if you like what you see here today and appreciate this very important discussion, that you like our Facebook, or excuse me, like our YouTube page, subscribe to it, check out our website, socialistaction.org. And with that, I just want to begin with a very wide open question for Rob Wallace. Rob, we are in an amazing, unprecedented pandemic. How in the heck did we get into this situation?
I like, Mark, that you start off with the easy questions, but indeed, it's in some ways, at least particularly for those of us in the global north, it seems to be unprecedented. And you did start off with some of the numbers that I was going to start off with. We were at over at least 200 million cases, which is probably an underestimate as much as by 10 times. And we're at total deaths over 4 million, again, probably an underestimate. I think it seems unprecedented, particularly in global north, because I mean, my vantage of it is that, historically speaking, over the last 500 years, the onset of colonialist capitalism, the global north has primarily treated the global south as both its refrigerator and its toilet. So in essence, you have extractivist capitalism centered around the equator, by which all the resources of the global south are extracted out and taken to the global north. And all the damage from that is centered in the equator to the tune of millions of people dead annually. And so, for those in the global south, this isn't unprecedented. This is another in the series of hundreds of years long outcome of a system that is in essence alienated from the ecologies and epidemiologies of our planet. The surprise comes because we've reached the point where, the damage that's accrues is everywhere all at once. And obviously climate change is certainly one example along those lines, but the pandemic is also another example of that. So in that sense, the notion of it being unprecedented is really what's unprecedented is now that those who have those countries and classes that have spent considerable time and effort to center the damage on the poorest and primarily Black and brown people of the planet are now suffering the outcome of their truly diabolical and sociopathic ways by which to socially reproduce ourselves from generation to generation. So the other thing about it not being quite unprecedented is that, this is something that many epidemiologists and public health experts have been warning about for several decades now, in part out of the incessant demand to destroy the landscape, turning it into commodities. We are profoundly having a traumatic impact on the kind of ecological matrix that keeps pathogens from emerging in the first place. So I got into this game in the kind of the turn of the century. I had been doing, I had started doing postdoc work in the University of California, looking at genetic sequences of H5N1. That was like the first celebrity virus of the century. If you remember, that was the bird flu, emerged in Guangdong, southeastern province in Guangdong. Before it, the danger was when it got into humans, it would kill 60%. The worry was that it would go human to human and we would have a terrible pandemic. Didn't quite do that, but H5N1 still around, circulating, experimenting with a variety of poultry and humans. So perhaps despite the fact that its day seems to have passed, it's still around doing its thing. And, from that time, on the annual, you had new pathogens emerge. At such a rate that we're down up to maybe even 2 pathogens, threatening to go pandemic a year. And of course, COVID-19, for obvious reason, has taken center stage. But that doesn't mean that, this is it. We're at the, in the season finale of Pandemic, the series, and that'll be it. And we can switch to a new series, maybe called Climate Change or something. This is something that's going to continue on. And, the warning signs were, as I said, pathogens were emerging on the annual almost. We talked about H5N1, other avian influenzas, H7N9 was a fair warning. It's a whole series of license plates of the avian and swine influenzas. We all remember 2009 H1N1. That's the swine influenza. They emerged outside Mexico City that actually went human to human and went pandemic. It wasn't virulent as we thought, but it did leave 500,000 dead in ways that we may have forgotten. But you have other pathogens emerging along the way. We had SARS-1 in 2002, emerge out of South Central China. We had MERS, that's the Middle East version of the coronavirus, emerge out of Saudi Arabia and Jordan, out of the industrialized camel herds, and then of course, we do, of course, have COVID-19, and we'll talk about its origins in a second. But, there it is. You have 3 major deadly SARS or coronaviruses emerged in 18 years. And along with it, a variety of other coronaviruses that spilled over into humans that didn't do as much damage. But it really speaks to the barrage of coronaviruses that are spilling over out of their bat reservoirs into human populations. But also, Zika, and there was the Ebolas, the West Africa Ebola, and then the one in Congo. And despite the fact that we have a working vaccine for the Ebola, though the second one, the one in the Congo, was actually the longest circulating Ebola outbreak that we've had. And So, a variety of pathogens. I mean, most of us were caught surprised by SARS-2 only because our attention was on a virus called African swine fever that originated in Africa, decades ago. It was identified circulating among wild hog and then a domestic hog and, out in the environment before it spilled over into some of the colonial powers in the Iberia Peninsula, then subsequently, decades later, made its way across Europe into Eastern Europe before it found itself in 2018 in China, killing half of China's hog. The hog immune system is very similar to the human immune system, so we were all very worried about the possibility that African swine fever could go human to human, and it still can. It has this really extraordinary combinations of modes of infection. So it can infect a live hog, it can infect dead hog, it could propagate in the environment before spilling over into a hog again. It can survive cured meat for 15 years, and so you have a variety of modes by which this virus can survive and wait out any intervention before it finds the opportunity. And a lot of the new pathogens are along those lines. So, coronaviruses, including the taxa that SARS-2, that COVID-19, that SARS-2 that causes COVID-19 comes from. Those coronaviruses have spilled over into wild animals, into wild food animals, into industrial animals, livestock, into humans. And so, in other words, a plethora of largely RNA viruses, but also many very different from each other. And yet, how is it that all of them are we suffering a barrage in this way? If you think about the Ebola from, that were identified in the mid-70s, it would typically spill over into a village or two. The case fatality rates were about 90%, really terrible damage. Take out a village or two, takes out guerrilla troop or two, really dangerous and terrible outcomes, but largely staunched at that point. And then, flipping over to 2013, when the West African strain of Ebola emerged, genetics not very different from those that preceded it. Same kind of epidemiological parameters in terms of its spread, in terms of the modes of infection. And yet that strain went on to infect 35,000 people, killing 11,000 and leaving bodies in the streets of local regional capitals. So what's going on? I mean, if the virus, and a lot of attention's on the viruses themselves, as they should be, because they're the things that causes the disease. But that's the thing about kind of reduction to science, the inability to see beyond merely that the pathogens aren't the only thing that's causing the disease. And so our team actually kind of figured out, it's an unfortunate natural experiment going on as all these new pathogens emerge and spread and threatened to go pandemic, and a couple of them did go pandemic. We began to kind of piece together the kind of other part of the causes, subset of causes that lead into these new pathogens emerging. And that is that it not only do we have causality in the object of the virus, but also out into the field of social relationships that extend across the planet. So we start to focus on the kind of the political economy that, in essence, unplugs or destroys local ecologies and social orders, and in the name of productivity and in profit, and then reconnects all those ecologies in a way that allows these pathogens to emerge and spread in the way they weren't able to do before. And so, the West Africa Ebola example is a good one because, and we've gotten to the point that we got a little nasty about it. We started calling these new infections after names other than their phylogenetic position or the molecular characteristics. So, for instance, we call the West African Ebola the neoliberal Ebola, after the structural adjustment programs that have, really opened up West Africa to multinational introgression, and we have, industrial agriculture moving in. We have logging and mining in a way that destroys the forest. And what happens is that, if you've ever been in a rainforest, it's a really complex place. It's really mind-boggling, and even people who have grown up there have, it's quite something to understand the complexity of the forest, and that complexity actually does work for us. And I'm not saying that it's doing it consciously; it doesn't care about humans. But in the act of actually boxing, being so complex, it's really hard for a pathogen to line up a whole bunch of hosts to shoot out and then out of the forest and out into the greater landscape. So that complexity acts as a kind of buffer. But what happens when you allow, industrial agriculture to come in, if you allow logging and mining, you basically destroy the forest, strip it down, you simplify it. And a lot of the host species, the reservoirs for these pathogens, die out. So they'll die out, as will their pathogens. But other host species actually do quite well under the circumstances. I mean, a lot of the animals that we think of as they're not robots. They have a considerable behavioral plasticity, and they respond in a way that's to their benefit. So in North America, when we destroy the wetlands along the Gulf of Mexico, the various geese species, the lesser snow geese and such, did not just roll over and die. They go, okay, we can't do our summering over here anymore. Where else are we going to go? And they see all this wonderful grain being grown as far north here as Minnesota. And so they start summering in all these farms, and they start fattening up, and their populations actually explode in size, such that when they winter over in La Perouse Bay up in Canada, they destroy all the landscape there because there's so many of them. But along with fattening up and growing in their population size, they have a greater interface with the local poultry now in these farms as well, which increases the traffic of the avian influenzas that they're and other diseases that they're hosting. So in essence, there's an example in which you disconnect the previous ecologies and reconnect them in new ways that allow previously marginalized pathogens this new way to move forward. Same thing with Ebola. In this case, you don't have geese, you have bats. Typically insectivore bats or frugivore bats that eat fruit. The forest is being destroyed. They don't roll over and die. Instead migrate to the new monoculture plantations. And what's not to love? It's a beautiful place. You don't have any predators. You don't have any competitors. You have a lot of space between your roosting site and your foraging sites. And so they do actually quite well under the circumstances. But of course, you increase the interface between the humans, the labor that's now been recruited and proletarianized by virtue of the land grabs of the multinationals. So you have local peoples that previously had done their own regenerative agroforestry are now forced into working as labor on these new highly capitalized plantations. And so the interface between these humans and these bats increases. But in addition, because the local peoples have lost their land, it's very classic, Marxist notion of the rise of capitalism in England. You have your land grabs, you have the proletarianization. Peoples in West Africa had to actually migrate into the cities for work, for salaried work. But also they would migrate back to help with familial plots during the planting season. So you have a kind of cycle migration going on in such a way that any Ebola that spills over doesn't just take out a village or two. Now it has a straight shot through the peri-urban landscape, all the way through to the local regional capitals of millions of people, in a way, by virtue of this cycle migration that labor is going through. And so, foundational shifts in the epidemiologies in such a way that even if the virus doesn't evolve, it now has a completely changed battlefield or landscape or playing field by which it can suddenly string together a lot more hosts in a way that it didn't do before. What with the structural adjustment in, requires the countries, in order to get these loans, to open up their economies to multinational interventions, destruction of domestic economy, but also the decline in outlays for public health and animal health, so that when you do have a spillover event, you have less likely ability to identify that a pathogen has emerged. So anyway, this is an example. The Ebola is an example of the kind of thinking and model that we converged on, in that you have this circuit of production going on between the local forest through the peri-urban landscape, that's the kind of rural areas that are turning urban, all the way to the local capital. And a pathogen that's able to emerge in any one part of that circuit You arrive at the regional capital, get on the plane, and in a matter of days, you could be having martinis on the beach in Miami. This is from the pathogen's perspective. And so all those pathogens that we started off with and in our description, they emerge in different parts of that circuit of production. So Ebola starts deep in the forests and the bats spilling over. The avian and swine influenzas that we described, they spill over more toward the city end of things, that polarity, that polar part of it, in the sense of, the outer rings of many large cities have more industrialized farming to feed the city. And so the industrial production leads to selecting for the more dangerous pathogens in a way that we can talk about in due course. But you have spillover in that end, and then you have pathogens that are kind of emerged along that circuit of production. So Zika comes to mind, but I think COVID-19, SARS-2, that's the pathogen that caused COVID-19, emerged in this way. And so, there are a couple visions and versions and hypotheses about the emergence of COVID-19. Maybe we could get into it, but the field hypothesis sees China. I know I'm talking a long time, and I apologize, but I think I'm trying to answer your question. So, but you have, China underwent the kind of BRICS model of development. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They said, fuck this shit, if you allow me the technical language here, that we're not going to let the Europeans and Americans develop our landscape. We're going to do it our own. I'm not going to get into here if it was the right call, but the BRICS countries decide to do capitalism their way. They self-exploited themselves. They also engage in sub-imperium exploitation, intervening in other global South countries. But what they did indeed move millions of people out of poverty. It also left millions of people behind in poverty. But that's that self-exploitation alongside the kind of NATO kind of led exploitation, extractivism, leads into an acceleration of the decline in the forests and the exploitation of the forests, leading to the increase of interfaces between reservoir of hosts of pathogens and the spillover events that have happened and accrued in a way that we find ourselves under the barrage of multiple coronaviruses, multiple Ebola viruses, and a variety of other pathogens now that are targeting us.
That's a very deep and well thought out explanation, Rob. Thank you. A lot of things that you said reminded me of some of the things that I touched on in my article that I wrote for Socialist Action newspaper. I used a quote from Bertolt Brecht's, I think it was Three Penny Opera, where he says, what is robbing a bank to owning a bank? And I'm reminded of your the part in your book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, where you mention, and I want to just maybe not go too long into this, but to talk about how the economic crisis of the Great Recession coincides with this period where JP Morgan Chase takes $300 million and invests into the poultry industry, right, in China. And I think it begins to get to, your point about the neoliberal pandemic, right? And how, their control of these markets. Here we have a period where now finance capital now accounts for like 40% of economic activity in the United States, whereas in the 70s it was, like 11%. Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which, and maybe I was a little bit, using some liberties in my language just to sort of illustrate the dramatic nature of how something so disconnected, say, from the farm, the bank, can be responsible in a very important way for the mess that we're in right now. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so much in what you said that I'm trying to figure out a number of ways of addressing it. I will share here, though, that I haven't gotten to writing this essay yet, but it's in my interpretation that a lot of the fascination, particularly with post-World War II's flying saucers, was in part the kind of expression, particularly in rural areas, was an expression of a kind of the aspect of having, the various depictions of cows being taken up into space, or farmers themselves, and violated by some strange mechanisms, by strange creatures. And to me, it was really emblematic of, it is emblematic of the kind of post-World War II livestock revolution, whereby banks out east are, suddenly being able to invest in a kind of mode of production that turns a natural economy, which is what farming is. You're still embedded into the cycles of the season and the cycles of reproduction of the animals and plants that you're doing. And all of a sudden you're gravitated toward, the industrializing food production in a way that's like making widgets. But the shock of it is the farmer having to contend not only with just the damage and worries of raising, doing agriculture, which is difficult enough. You don't, droughts and floods and all these other things are difficult enough, but then to also be held responsible to markets far elsewhere, or even secondary markets that are betting on your combinations of prices of variety of animals and crops, months in advance, that has nothing to do with, as a farmer, your relationship to the land and how to actually produce food out of it. And so the sense of irreality of being hijacked or kidnapped in a way by forces that have nothing to do with your town life and I mean, this isn't to say that farmers aren't aware of the global market and all that. It just has to do with a sense of this is the worry and hideous wonder of capitalist realism, of it projecting itself upon what we know is to be reality of our sociality among ourselves, the ecologies upon which we depend. All of a sudden, are all those things that we know in our day-to-day life to be real are all of a sudden turn subservient to the necessities of bankers abroad that who are projecting us off planet Earth in a way that is divorced from the realities of what we need to do in terms of be able to socially reproduce ourselves from generation to generation. And so their capitalist realities are treated as if they're more real than what we all know are the necessities of feeding flesh and building community that is necessity for us to persist. And that goes back really early to the early parts of the country. You brought up J.P. Morgan. Our group had an article in the Monthly Review about this. Along the lines that it's ironic because if you can remind me, who was in the Hamilton, which is the Lin-Manuel Miranda's Broadway extravaganza, his rival, I can't remember exactly. Do you remember who Hamilton's rival was? No, nobody. Anyway, and he, of course, was considered one of the founding fathers and such. And I feel really bad that I don't remember enough. If you could look it up, Mark, I would really appreciate that, because then it makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, I don't. That other fellow actually is set up. What happened was in Manhattan, there kind of had a tanning industry that destroyed the lower Manhattan water supply. And so this founding father was like, okay, look, I'll pipe in water from elsewhere and we'll clean things up. But in reality, he was more interested in getting the thumbs up to be able to set up a new bank, which ultimately turned into J.P. Morgan. And in the course of spending more of his time Mark's having a little problem with his laptop here. I'm going to quickly look it up. Hamilton's rival, right? And I know all of you on online are going, of course, don't you know who that is? Aaron Burr, right? So Aaron Burr, he was he set up this bank in a way, and the irony, of course, is that the focus was. And Burr went on to actually shoot Hamilton, the whole story, all that stuff. It's a brilliant musical that also has the politics of the horrible neoliberal bullshit that you can imagine. But it really is remarkable that all of us lefties should be taking notes about how to explain, communistic, socialistic practices and histories in a way that to encourage people to take them on, rather than, a black and brown version of slaveholders. I mean, that really takes some cojones to actually present this and get millions and to sign off on such a hideous possibility. But Burr did set up this bank, and his focus was on the bank to such a point that they did such a bad job of piping in water that it led to outbreaks of malaria in downtown Manhattan. So right from the beginning, capital always took front and center before the kind of ecological and epidemiological necessities of having large groups of people living together. And then we can see that continuing on here with this particular outbreak as well, COVID-19, everybody back into the processing plants, everybody back to work, the desire to actually not do anything necessary to actually get out from underneath an outbreak. Other countries didn't have that problem. They saw the outbreak as an existential threat enough to actually bring down the hammer on it in terms of not only, and this is before vaccines were even available. So they engage in the Tetris program. That's testing, that's tracing, that's isolation. Masks were enforced. There were shelter at home, but even those, they also had all sorts of social services and programs to pay people to stay home in a way that was not the case here in the U.S. The fact of the matter is that public health has been largely destroyed the last 40 years with the kind of neoliberal turn here. Public health was basically redefined as just a relationship between you and your doctor, in which every minute is that you're with your doctor is billable for a variety of different codes that they punch into your computer there. But of course, that is not something that the pathogen cooperates with it. The pathogen didn't get the government memo from the insurance companies, Aetna and all the other ones, that you're supposed to only infect people in a way that can be billable. And so all the things that we imagine and think of in terms of public health that other countries have been able to handle, and this isn't just China or Vietnam, not just socialistic countries, but you do have other countries like New Zealand and Iceland and the early days of Uruguay before they got tired and COVID had exploded. We're really understanding what governance is about. Governance is actually about taking care of your people. There's some element of that. Of course, there's always people, the rich stealing money everywhere and under all the programs, but there's an aspect of at least, that should be done. US, not a clue. We scraped it all out the last 40 years. So it isn't just a matter of Trump incompetence. Of course, he is a mass murderer. He did put 500,000 Americans in the ground. He is culpable for this. But we see here, now that Biden's in office, you have many of the same problems. Soon as the vaccine came, we dropped whatever little minimal masking recommendations. They weren't even mandates, in a way that allowed the Delta variant to emerge in a way and spread in a way that somehow it seems to have caught CDC by surprise. It's not. It's because we have our epidemiological infrastructure dedicated to supporting making billionaires richer. Now, historically, what that involved was, coming off post-World War II. Yes, the U.S., from administration to administration basically said, we're in the business of basically running the global capitalist system. So that's why we have bases around the world to beat down any regime that doesn't just turn over its lands to our exploitation. What is their oil? What is our oil doing under their land, right? So there's that part. But the CDC was a part of that as well, in that the capitalist system might generate the outbreaks everywhere around the world, but the CDC was thinking relationally, relational geographies, that what happens out there might come back to our shores. So we're going to send our top-notch people to go to help squash outbreaks in a way that it doesn't destroy the capitalist system. What Trump didn't do was that he didn't get the memo, right? This is what happens when you have a decline in the political class. Clearly we don't have enough of a political class around presenting the interests of the proletariat, but we also had suddenly under the Clintons and Obamas a kind of decline in the verve of the political system for the bourgeoisie, in a way to allow a kind of semi-fascistic authoritarian to emerge. A total bumbler, true, but still at the hands of the wheel of a system that he didn't get the memo that what you're supposed to do when you run the US is to run the world capitalist system. And his position, Trump's position, is really a sign of weakness of American might, because he wanted to devolve into bilateral agreements that he could try to bully one country over the other, but it's really a kind of low-level scheme that doesn't lost the big picture of what capitalist imperial might here stemming out of the US is about. So, well, what is my point about all this? So, Trump moves us out of the WHO. Again, not a sign of strength, a sign of weakness, signaling to countries around the world that that they need to look to another imperial power, and that could be China. It may not work out that way. The Earth may not be in a position to be able to handle another cycle of accumulation. So the notion that it's a Chinese century coming up is not necessarily a done deal. Now, why did I bring this up? Because when Biden gets into office, despite the fact that, he sees that, COVID-19 exists and it's a problem, somehow the system is incapable of responding in a way to actually engage the full apparatus of a public health intervention to put COVID down, because that apparatus is dead and gone. And the institutional memory of it is gone. And the institutional cognition, that is the capacity of a governance to be able to think through the nature of a problem, that is in utter disarray. And so you see that whatever CDC does, and it pivots from one bad decision to another, it's always slow, they're dithering, they don't get the right thing. It speaks to the incoherence of the political class in the US of being able to do that, because they're just so used to being on the far side of the American cycle of accumulation, of turning capital back into money, meaning the capitalist class is cashing out. They are not about building empire. They are not on the front end of accumulation, of turning money into capital and building imperial infrastructure. They're on the far end. We're cashing out. They are done with the imperial American model. They're exhausted. And there's just a land rush for what little of the public commons are left to privatize what's left. And so you have the rise of a kind of, in an encouragement of a kind of really private ideology, a kind of individualistic ideology that has always been here in the United States, but really, it's really let to go free in a way that, you've got people who have been smashed by neoliberal interventions, both in urban and rural areas, that are now seeing that, not vaccinating is waving my goddamn flag, when actually it's, both an expression of the kind of individualistic ideology of a system that can't deliver public health, and also a kind of suicide pact. You have the picture of the horrible picture of the various Afghans who got on the last of the C-17s flying out of Kabul and falling off, and what compelled them to do that, right? And I think their beatific suicides are not the only ones at the end of empire. The decision not to vaccinate, which clearly has protective capacity, even though people still can infect other people if you're vaccinated. But the refusal to do that really marks, yes, a distrust in governance that came out of several decades of abandoning, rural areas. And but in addition, you could file that away as the kind of diseases of despair that led to the election of Trump in 2016. So, refusal to vaccinate goes hand in hand with the opioid epidemic. It goes hand in hand with the alcoholism and all the other things. So, these are the refusal. I think I would characterize as a kind of disease of despair, and also a failure of governance to actually try to convince people. So what Trump did to the blue states in the early pandemic, which is to say, most of the outbreak is on the coast, fuck them, and not doing anything. Biden is doing to the red states now at this point. He's saying, if you don't get the vaccines, you fuckers can die. You got to understand that, the nice turn of what, the relaxation of government, the sense of returning to normalcy. Normalcy is not nice. I mean, it really is about, leading thousands of black and brown and white working people to their deaths, so to keep a machinery that produces expropriated profit at unheard of rates in the history of our civilization. So we've really tracked far from your question, I know. And to be frank, I don't remember what you asked, but I think much of what I said was connected.
Yeah, it was. We were beginning with like where the culpability of the financial system or finance capital in this pandemic, and you've touched on that and other things too. So thank you for that, such an expansive response. Just going to take a little pause, folks. If you are tuning in, we are here with Rob Wallace, epidemiologist, author of Dead Epidemiologist, which Rob is thankfully still alive here with us, and author of Big Farms Make Big Flu Dispatches on Infectious Disease, Agribusiness, and the Nature of Science. Rob, what should I say? What I was going to say is, if you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button on our YouTube page. Check out socialistaction.org. You touched on so many things, and I wish we had many hours to speak, but we have about 15 minutes left. There was a part in your book that struck me regarding, the profitability of mass death, for example, and how something that could be considered like a collectivized response, or I would say somewhat of a collectivized response to a pandemic. You mentioned in your book, Big Farms Make Big Flu, that the World Health Organization for 50 years or so has been collecting the genetic information of different pathogens and flus and things like that, and then takes this free of charge, gives it to pharmaceutical corporations, who then turn around, use that genetic information to make efficacious vaccines. Meanwhile, due to the fact that this is a profit-making enterprise, the vaccine industry, it goes to the richest countries first, and hardly ever is going to get to the poorest nations. Socialist action, even though what you very well laid out originally would sort of make this impossible in our paradigm, but socialist action is for a vaccine mandate. I mean, we consider people walking around, even the vaccinated, as you mentioned, can infect other people. They're like walking time bombs out there. And just by virtue of saying that the vaccine is essential and maybe we need to educate people, doesn't seem to be enough to convince people that this is what we need to do. To the extent that it is possible, what is your take on both the inequities in the vaccine distribution? Clearly, it's baked into the system, but is a vaccine mandate, in your opinion, and we stand by it, even though, as you mentioned, again, it can't be really carried out under our current system, is that something that you would support?
I think that a really essential variable in epidemiology is trust, and you have to build trust with your populace. And I'm speaking from the vantage point of governance that I am not part of, right? But historically speaking, and even today, in the countries that in which they succeed in their non-pharmaceutical interventions and keeping outbreaks from happening, bringing outbreaks to an end within 4 to 5 months. I mean, can you look back with wonder a year ago where the Kiwis down in New Zealand were going to the rugby matches without masks together, while we were all holed up for a very long time. We gave up on that. We've gone to 17, 18 months now, and we're still, as you started us off, still feeling the brunt of an outbreak that we should have been able to handle in short order. And of course, all those things are missing. So what do we do? A lot of the focus on vaccine alone isn't enough. There's something what's called the Swiss cheese model of epidemiological interventions, and that is you start off with one layer and one intervention, say the vaccines, but it's got holes in it, right? So the vaccines they provide disease immunity, meaning if you're given the vaccine, you probably won't get sick or hospitalized, but it's not sterilizing immunity. You're still likely to infect other people. So vaccines aren't enough of an intervention. So we do another layer of intervention, and that has holes too. And then another layer, it might be the Tetra stuff that other countries have done, the testing, the tracing, the isolation. That requires, of course, hiring hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to go out there and act as community health workers and to knock on doors and politely work with people. It's not, kicking the door down and jabbing people, right? This is not the way forward. You have to, work through people's completely reasonable questions, even people's batshit crazy questions. And the first day you knock on the door, they say "fuck you," and this is the U.S. Maybe they'll brandish a gun on you, but community health worker, you come back a few days later and you say hello and you start a conversation and you build a rapport necessary to have conversations to work with people through their bullshit that has been ideologically imposed in part by a government that abandoned them. And so in other words, we have a government, what I'm proposing is in essence a compensatory fantasy of a government that actually cared about its people enough to do this. But under this model, you would do those things to build up the trust, and you would do things. Another layer so that we don't have the horrible photos of the early pandemic of Black and brown workers in New York on the subway bunched together on their way en masse to do service jobs, to allow the liberals, wealthy liberals who can pat themselves on the back, that they're engaged in the virtue hoarding of being able to stay home and do right by the world, that allows that Black and brown working people aren't able to do. So you're basically paying people to stay home largely and wait this out. But those are the various layers of the Swiss cheese model that you do on top one on the other in such a way that allows this thing to work. And and we talked about the failure of the kind of reductionist model to just see a pathogen as being the source of an outbreak, that causality extends out into the field of the social relationships that extend beyond any nation's borders onto one side of the world to the other. This is why we view, cities like Hong Kong, New York, and London as being hotspots by virtue of the fact that they are sources of the capital that drive the deforestation development around the world that leads to the spillover events in the first place, right? So that kind of relational thinking isn't critically important. But it's the same that we would do the same when we come to talk about the interventions, right? These are pathogens that are wily, and I describe the African swine fever being able to infect in a number of modes of infection. And this is what a lot of the new pathogens are doing. They do not succumb on the polio model, where you just have a vaccine that takes care of business. You have to do multiple modes of intervention. Vaccine isn't enough. And the effort to turn around and point fingers at Trumpists, and some of them are horrible. There was various demonstrations across the country. I think I saw photos of the one in New York, really terrible, hideous anti-vax things, and they're horrible. But governance, on a personal level, punch fascists in the nose and all this, but on a public health level, unfortunately, because all our health is tied together, you have to find a way to be able to talk to people who don't necessarily agree with you. And that goes for in all kinds of political action, and there's the old lefty chestnut. If you don't talk to the worker, then the fascists will. So somehow you're going to have to be able to learn how to talk to people that you don't particularly like or politically get along with, and work on the hard work of getting around to talking to people in a way that otherwise, if you see the landscape as much of the neoliberal political class did, and allow the rise of an incompetent fascist that killed 500,000 Americans. So you do have to do the talking and working through in the building of trust in a way that does that, that involves doing that. And, mandates, obviously they're already in place, right? All of us are vaccinated for all sorts of childhood diseases that allowed us to go to school. So it's already in place. It could be done on a place by place basis. But for the most part, I'm more on the side of rebuilding the notion of what public health is, rebuilding public health in America, rebuilding trust in a way, and that is, again, not going to happen under this particular system that sees engorging billionaire profit as being its number one thing. So it's a political problem as much as the pragmatics of public health. And so, we can talk about the specific things that need to be done, but they have to be tied into, broader shifts in political practice. Now, the weird thing about liberals pointing fingers at Trumpists and saying, oh, you fuckers are not getting vaccinated, you're endangering everybody else, is that if they really believe that, then they would operate that on the global scale. So they would go to the Bill Gates Foundation and say, what you did basically ruined us. Because what Bill Gates did is that he went with the pharmaceutical companies, and along the lines of what you described in terms of the vaccines against H5N1 that I wrote about, big pharma make big flu, that model was recapitulated in how vaccination happened out of WHO. WHO began with an open medicine model that they were going to allow all pharmaceutical data and prophylaxis to be allowed to be freely distributed around the world. Gates went in there with the American and European pharmaceutical companies, put a kibosh on that. So instead, Gates has profound, and other, philanthrocapitalists have profound influence on the intergovernmental agencies now. So WHO, 70% of its budget comes from the foundations at this point. And so they, when those foundations whistle, then the WHO does what they ask. And so Gates went in there and imposed a kind of, I think what's called the COVID-19 Act Accelerator, which is going to ostensibly distribute vaccines at discounted prices to 20% of the populations of the poorest countries, but entirely based on the intellectual property rights model, in such a way that the pharmaceutical companies are not obligated to distribute their vaccines for anything other than market rate, in such a way that's why we're in the place we are now. That's why most of the world isn't vaccinated. So if liberals are upset that Trump is, punching down, and don't get me wrong, I don't like Trumpists, but if you're punching down on poor and working people here because they're not getting vaccinated, and not blaming Biden administration for not doing the kind of, following the Swiss cheese model and actually sending hundreds of thousands of public health, community health workers out there to convince people, then you are also, as a liberal, hypocritical because you have not taken on the Gates of the world, who have actually stopped vaccination campaigns around the world, allowing variants to emerge in a way that will subsequently allow the pathogen, the virus, to escape the vaccines that we have in place. So instead of the race that we were on, which we should have been on, which is the world, are going to vaccinate everybody and race to get everybody vaccinated so that we can drive the pathogen underneath its population of replacement, its capacity to continue to spread. And we're going to do it in a way that we're going to race against the capacity of the virus to evolve vaccine escape. We got rid of that. We're not doing that. Instead, we replace it with a different race. We're going to race against the virus's capacity to escape vaccines by developing boosters to revaccinate rich people who've already paid for it, and then screw everybody the rest around the world. I mean, some countries aren't due for being vaccinated until 2024. I mean, what do you think that's going to do for the capacity of the virus to evolve out from the things that we've developed, however successful they've been so far? It's not a categorical intervention. Just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean things are going to go well. I mean, they do work for now, but it's a circumstantial situation. It's a fluid situation. I remember the early models in March 2020 projecting the outbreak to continue under worst case scenario of being 2024. I mean, we're looking at 2025, multiple waves every year at this. And you can see the absolute decline in institutional, cognition, the incompetence of the political class of both political parties here in the U.S., but also in other neoliberal countries like you think of Great Britain and France and such. And the and other countries are just the global South. Some countries are just inundated by either fascistic governance in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Modi in India, or just being overwhelmed and not having the public health capacity to do so. Weird countries are doing quite well. Panama now is engaged in both the vaccine campaign and the non-pharmaceutical intervention. Uruguay did very well at the start, as I noted, but they fell apart and aren't doing very well. So countries around the world are in various stages of disorganization. The US is disorganized as a matter of principle and refuses to engage in the public health interventions that, in essence, would signal that we have a public commons, that we should develop it, that we should practice it, because it means we are engaged in a social practice other than enriching billionaires. Ultimately, this failure of vaccination isn't about, anti-vaxxers or unvaccinated who can't get to work and get out of work to be able to go back, get vaccinated. It's about a government that basically abandoned its purview to help the American people under both business parties. And on the global stage, it's the American and NATO countries imposing their vision of intellectual property rights that come first and foremost, beyond not just the lives and well-being of billions of people of the global South, but also billions of people in the global North, because by allowing the virus to circulate out and about unchecked, it means that the vaccines that we have presently are all in likelihood going to start to fail. And they've already, in this past year, the data coming in showing the declining efficaciousness of the of the vaccines in the face of not only Delta variant, but the other variants. So this is where we're at. And it's a difficult, terrible moment, but if we're ever going to unplug out of that system, we have to, in essence, unplug out of what is, in essence, political theater, by which liberals smash Trumpists punch back, and both of them are, in essence, signing off on the deaths of millions of people. So I don't know, Mark. Mark's screen went dark. I don't know where he is. So I can talk some more while we're waiting, but I think we're getting down here toward the end here. So until Mark gets back, maybe I'll say some final words about things. And I would say that, I painted a very dark picture about what's going on, but it's absolutely necessary to confront where things are. However, I am a purveyor of hope as well. And I do think very much that we can get out of it. Certainly this past year and a half has been a kick in the ass. And you can see it in a variety of people of all walks of life, are really starting to see things in a clear-eyed way that they perhaps weren't able to before. You get trashed by the daily day-to-day obligations of getting enough money to survive and pay rent and food and stuff. And of course, we're still under the gun in that direction. But clearly, a system that signals itself that it doesn't give a fuck about much of the population, and is struggling delivering on the goods, particularly here in the U.S., but elsewhere. And so, there have been, models around the world for, that did well, that didn't do well, but there's histories of attempts by doing things differently, of basically returning humanity back into the ecological matrix that had never really left. So if we want to stop these pathogens from emerging in the first place, we have to do the things necessary to provide the buffers that keep pathogens from spilling over. We have to recognize that, we can't do infinite growth on a finite planet. So capitalism is in essence the sociopathic system. It's not really engaged in, it does deliver goods, but not in a way that is in any way sustainable to our humanity or our existence of our species. What pathogens aren't doing, climate change will finish up with. It's really a destructive historical moment we're in. And it really involves unplugging ourselves out of this. A lot of the kids know what's down. My hat's off to the new generation. My kids routinely schools me on a lot of things. And, the students I teach, they, ostensibly are very much, politically centrist, but they are very much engaged in, foundational, political education, very much clear-eyed before I even ever open my mouth in a class. So it's not these, rads like me ruining the next generation. Their lived experience, their understanding of the various guns we're under has very much changed their mind about what's going on, including here in the U.S. in what was called the belly of the beast. So, but experiments are happening around the world of doing things differently, both in terms of new agricultures, but new public healths. And I think in the end, global solidarity is the way forward, being able to find and reach out to peoples around the world who are trying to do things differently, because the bourgeoisie are organized at the global level. And if you want to defeat them and move in a new direction that involves saving humanity and saving ourselves from the worst of the outcomes of the path that we're on, we're going to have to make some considerable sharp turns. And, there are indigenous groups around the world who have fought back for hundreds of years against this. They understand what this, I'm not about fetishizing them. I'm not putting them on pedestals. They're humans too, but it's more a matter of they have a clear understanding of their different pathways of doing this. So actually kind of unplugging out of the system that also energizes its opposition, and trying to, position ourselves out of that framework is I think a good path forward. So to start to organize and get everything from the day-to-day block, the kind of mutual aid stuff. It's not just an anarchistic practice. Mike Davis writes in his latest book, I think The Old Gods, New Enigmas. That first chapter there is really amazing, describes the long socialist history in America and Europe of engaging in mutual aid at the neighborhood level. It wasn't just in the factories. So, of course, the Global South is a well of new ideas about how to do things differently. And we should start to listen to them and, take their lead and avoid the worst of the global North prejudices that extend even into the deepest left, of looking down on our brothers down there, brothers and sisters, and really just, you got to get out of that. I mean, if anything, this last year and a half showed our way of doing things is not the best way in any way, shape, or form. And, unplug out of that shit, reprogram. Every day should be, a sense of birth, a rebirth, of rethinking how we feel about things, how we do things. experimenting how to do new practices, reprogramming ourselves out of a system that basically that divides and conquers people in terrible ways. And as much as many of the opposition are horrible, and we do have a right to defend ourselves against the most fascistic expressions of it, we also have to start to kind of heal the metabolic rifts, the ecological rifts between urban and rural, but also the political ones as well. And so that involves a lot of political discipline to be able to do that. And so I see a lot of way forward in terms of doing this. The historical moment calls upon us to suddenly be people and do things that all of a sudden are indeed heroic in nature, but we have no other opportunity. We have no other path forward other than to foundationally change the nature of our societies.
Thank you so much, Rob. Your wealth of information is fascinating and so valuable to charting the way forward out of this crisis and into a new world. I wish we had more time to speak. I hope we can have you back on in the future. Me personally, I've been following this very closely. I'm fascinated by it. I have a background in biology myself, and I would love to get in touch with you to talk in more depth about this if I could.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to talk. So, and obviously, unfortunately, with the projections out for several years, there may be opportunity to have me back. And my job as an epidemiologist is, in essence, to put myself out of work in the sense of arriving at a place in time where our needs are met in such a way that, yes, there'll always be infectious diseases, but not to this terrible moment that we're in. And so, yes, I do think we'll have opportunity to speak again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob Wallace. And thanks everybody for tuning into this fascinating webinar. Please, again, if you like what you saw, please subscribe to our YouTube page by clicking the subscribe button, and check us out at socialistaction.org. And certainly check out Rob Wallace and all the books that he's put out, including Dead Epidemiologists and Big Farms Make Big Flus. Thanks so much, Rob Wallace, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon.